I wanted to just talk for a minute this morning. As you all can probably guess, if you don't know already, I'm not Celia Witten. And as you've heard, Celia Witten isn't here because of the government shutdown. And I wanted to thought it'd be interesting for folks. I'm going to take about 5 or 10 minutes to just sort of tell you, kind of give you the latest about what's happening in Washington, because it obviously affects all of us. So basically, the shutdown is in its 15th day, and we are 2 days before the government reaches its limit on debt borrowing. About 85 to 90% of federal employees have been furloughed. The FDA, which we've talked about a lot this morning, has pretty much stopped doing anything that they can't do with user fees from 2013. They've said they're not going to accept any new applications or submissions because they don't feel like, because they're not lawfully allowed to work on them, and they're not lawfully allowed to accept user fees for 2014 because they don't have, the way user fee works, just in case you don't know, is that there's actually a trigger in the congressional appropriation for FDA that allows them to collect user fees. And since there's no appropriation for FDA, they're not allowed to collect user fees. The CDC has said that it has reduced ability to respond to any kind of outbreak investigation, and it's reduced its support for the annual seasonal influenza program. The NIH, of course, has stopped funding any grants. For those of you who, of course, the whole purpose of this, according to many of the folks driving this train, conservative Republicans in the House, of course, the Affordable Care Act implementation goes on because that had nothing to do, that was never reliant on the congressional appropriations process. So we got here because Congress couldn't agree on fiscal year 2014 funding, and because a certain percentage, particularly of House Republicans, though not exclusively, essentially wanted to use the government funding process and the debt limit process to try to block implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And whether that would be defunding it or whether it would be trying different ways to block implementation of it. Just a little bit of, just for those of you who don't follow this every day like I do, sort of a little bit of history about this is that typically the conversations, well, going back, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to fund, right? And so Congress implemented that power through its appropriations committees, and each federal agency received their funding from Congress every year from the appropriations committee. And over time, there would periodically be disputes within the appropriations committee, as you might expect, about funding priorities for different agencies. But the committee was always populated by folks who were more interested in getting funding for their congressional districts than they were in partisan politics. It's a little bit of a self-selected group. That was the committee that all the earmarking and all the money that congressmen from San Diego might want to get money for highways in San Diego or what have you, those were the kinds of people who were on the appropriations committee. So it was always a bipartisan atmosphere because it really was about horse trading of federal projects. And what's happened over time is, particularly in the House leadership, starting with when Gingrich was Speaker, but then it's become even more so when Boehner became Speaker and Representative Cantor became Majority Leader, is they decided to use the appropriations process in a more, let's call it a larger political context, right, to try to make points about the role of government or to try to, as a way of pushing their agenda. And so what has happened is the power of the Appropriations Committee has actually dropped within the institution of Congress. Typically, the Appropriations Committee was the most powerful committee because it dictated all these spending. And whenever they had these kinds of disputes, they were always resolved, and they were always resolved within the context of the committee. So even if you had a contentious issue like abortion funding, right, which was always a pretty contentious issue, it would be a few people on the Appropriations Committee who would end up working out some kind of a compromise that allowed them to move forward. It was never considered to be an option that the government just wouldn't, that the committee wouldn't fund federal agencies. And that's obviously changed. And if you are an insider in Washington, you would note that all of the stories you read about the government shutdown and the funding decisions, you never see the Appropriations Committee chairman or ranking member of the Appropriations Committee quoted. And that's because they're basically completely shut out of this process. It's a process that's being done by the leadership on both sides. It's not a process that's being done by the people who actually historically are folks who work out these kinds of problems. And I think those kind of institutional changes, I think we're now sort of, the seeds were sown a number of years ago, and now that's what we've got. The other bit of history is the previous shutdown, of course, was in late 1995, lasted 26 days, and eventually President Clinton at the time and the congressional leaders reached an agreement. So where are we now is, as I mentioned, we have this shutdown. We have the government's ability to borrow against the debt deadline coming up. And we have, after weeks of nothing, we now suddenly have a whole series of negotiations that are happening and some proposals that are being floated. So in no particular order, House Republicans have today announced that they have their own piece of legislation, which they're going to try to vote on today, and then go take a recess, actually, or actually what they would refer to as district work period. But they're going to vote on a bill today which would open the government, the terms of which are open the government, lift the ceiling on the debt. The government stays open till January 15th. The debt limit runs until February 7th. A delay in the medical device tax for 2 years. The device tax, of course, part of the Affordable Care Act. They do eliminate the Department of Treasury's ability to take so-called extraordinary measures to avert default. So there's not a lot of detail in any of these proposals, but you all probably have heard that Secretary of the Treasury, Liu, has said, you know, even if we come up against this deadline on Thursday, you know, the Department of Treasury can kind of, you know, take some measures which can sort of delay default for a couple of weeks. And they also have provisions in there that require strict verification on some of the limit subsidy, income-related subsidies that exist under the Affordable Care Act. So we don't know what will happen. It would require virtually all the Republicans to vote for it. It's unusual for a majority party in the House to offer a bill publicly if the leadership wasn't confident that they already had the votes to enact it. But you know, we'll see. The White House has criticized the plan. In the meantime, in the Senate, we actually have bipartisan negotiations, which we don't have in the House. We have bipartisan negotiations in the Senate. So the two leaders, McConnell on the Republican side and Reid on the Democratic side, have been meeting over the last several days. The vice president has been involved in those conversations. And their latest proposal, which is being floated by the leaders within their respective party caucuses, also to try to have a vote today, would call for the following. A bicameral negotiating committee to try to work out sort of longer budget issues. And that committee would have to reach an agreement about the budget, and you know, including spending limits and all that, by December 13th, so about 2 months. The government would be opened and funded at 2013 levels through January 15th. The debt limit also raised until February 7th. The one thing that nobody is talking about here is, remember we had a sequester last year where the agencies took automatic budget cuts. So that law that implemented that sequester is still in effect, right? So new round of sequester cuts go into effect for all federal agencies on January 1st, unless Congress, right? The terms of all that were always unless Congress reached a budget agreement that mitigated that. So the idea of the reason why the January 15th is the deadline is because there's a sense of let's try to keep the government open, fund it at current levels, get us into January so the sequesters don't take effect immediately while we're working out this budget agreement. The Senate plan also has these stricter verification procedures about some of the income-related subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. So as I mentioned, the leaders are briefing their respective caucuses today. The hope is that there'll be votes today in the Congress. Now, you'll notice that the provisions are not exactly the same, which means the House and the Senate would have to negotiate those out, and then they would have to, both bodies would have to vote on the exact same bill and pass it, and the president would have to sign it for that to take effect. So I think if we were going to predict, we would say that they probably would reach some kind of an agreement this week. You never know. There's certainly the biggest challenge is going to be the Senate Republican leader being able to convince Senator Cruz and people on the hard right that they should agree to this deal, and jury's out on whether he'll be able to do that. But we do know that the strategy of using a shutdown to force a debate about the Affordable Care Act or to defund the Affordable Care Act did not work, because that, even Republican leaders in both bodies now have kind of abandoned that strategy and the act is going into effect, and they're now trying to negotiate future budget years. So whether or not this holds remains to be seen, and of course, just something to keep your eye on is that, again, all this does is open the government until January 15th and lift the debt limit till February 7th, which means, in theory, that we could be back in the soup, in 2 months, having this same exact conversation and potentiality of a shutdown. The interesting thing about it is that it would all take place then in an election year. So whether or not, you read a lot of reports about how voters are dissatisfied and want the partisanship to end and all that. But we'll see if that applies when everyone's individual member of Congress runs for re-election. Anybody have any questions? Comments? Just that's the latest. Yeah. Right. So that's a great question, and I forgot to. The lack of earmarks is sort of part of the demise of the Appropriations Committee for sure. I think it was part of the strategy. I think they also earmarks became a very unpopular thing, right? And it became sort of the poster child for folks who believed that Congress spending was out of control and there was no checks and balances on that. So I think folks who wanted to sort of centralize power were able to ride that wave in the way that you suggest. And there's no question that that's part of why those committees don't have power. And, I think for some people it was an unintended consequence. I think if you would have said to them, well, this is kind of where it's kind of ironic in some ways, right? Because the folks who were blamed for out-of-control spending were actually the people who, in a bipartisan way, were always able to negotiate how much spending there should be. And but that's absolutely part of why we're where we are. But that's not coming back. I mean, it's hard to imagine that people would now turn around and say, "Oh, well, we need to have earmarks." Somebody over here. Any other questions or comments about the shutdown? You all know that ARM has, and you heard from JT, we do have a legislative and congressional agenda, and we're making great progress, and it's now all on hold because many congressional offices also have their employees furloughed, so there just aren't a lot of staff around. And second of all, because many congressional offices are saying, if you don't want to come in and talk to us about this budget agreement, we don't want to talk to you. This is all we're doing. You can come back and talk to us when, the dust settles. So our efforts on a national strategy and doing all of that work, not just with the FDA or CMS, but also in Congress, have unfortunately also been delayed. So before we go to break, I just want to remind everybody about the reimbursement paper that we have. We have some of them outside. We have it posted on our website. You heard from the panel yesterday about the complicated reimbursement system and how you need to plan early, how you need to talk to payers, and how you need to understand your product, you need to understand payment, and that's exactly what this paper is meant to do. It was written by our reimbursement committee, and it's a sort of a step-by-step guide in terms of understanding the reimbursement environment, its impact on regenerative medicine, and to provide executives from companies or researchers with the tool so that you can start planning for your reimbursement strategy and understanding what types of products how certain types of products are reimbursed, under what systems in Medicare, what that means, what are the cost pressures. So I really encourage folks to pick up a copy of the paper or download it from our website. And with that, I think we're scheduled for a break until the company presentations pick up in about a half hour. Thanks.